This is a fascinating glimpse into early amateur radio in Manchester, going back almost 100 years, to wireless societies venturing into the unknown and experimental transmitting and receiving stations sharing newfound information. So join me in the early 1920s in the heart of Manchester as we look at no fewer than 10 individual wireless stations from the days when radio was truly in its infancy. As early as summer 1925, a series of shortwave transmitting tests were being conducted by the new Manchester and District Wireless Society from their experimental station G6 Mike X-ray. They were carried out on Saturdays between 6:30 and 7 p.m. on 45 metres, Sundays 7 until 7:30 p.m. on 90 metres, and Wednesdays 5 a.m. until 6 a.m. on 25 metres, and you can see an example of the contents of the transmission from that station. Special tests were also arranged, and members of the society reported on the reception of all transmissions from any part of the world. Any other experimenters that wanted to cooperate in tests on 3 to 5 metres were to notify the Honourable Secretary, Mr V.W.P. Evans, as early as possible. Now, there's much more to Manchester and District Wireless Society, but by the 1940s the call sign G6MX was owned by Michael Crowley Milling, brother of Sir Dennis Crowley Milling. Along with David Mitchell, G2 India India, and John Whiteman, G3 Alpha Hotel, Michael Crowley Milling was a member of what became affectionately known within the radio community as the Manchester Gang in the 1930s. He was a talented and successful engineering project manager who did innovative work in accelerator design and large-scale computer control. He later joined Metropolitan Vickers in Manchester, first as a graduate trainee and then a member of the engineering staff. During the Second World War, he worked on microwave radar, initially as a junior member of the team at the Radar Research Establishment at Malvern. The call sign is still classed as active today and still belongs to Michael Crowley Milling at his former station in Worsley in Manchester, although he passed away in 2012. By the summer of 1926, the Manchester and District Wireless Society were excited to carry out tests on the 23 metre band using their assigned call sign G6MX, as well as the additional call signs G5MB, G5WX and G2YO. Transmissions took place at all times during the day or night, and power levels varied between 5 watts and 250 watts. Now, this was all completely experimental in those days, and the Society was reaching out in wireless publications with a view to cooperating with other stations on 8 metres and comparing circuits and the likes in order to obtain more information about that particular wavelength. G6MX, G5MB and G5WX were usually active on 45 metres, and G2YO was fixed on 23 metres, with an 8 metre station in the planning stages. The stations G6MX and G2YO were registered to 66 Oxford Road, Manchester, a small dwelling which has long since disappeared under the city centre office blocks. This was the home of YWP Evans, the Society's Honourable Secretary. The station of G5MB belonged to WH Lamb of 808 Stockport Road, Longsight, also demolished, and G5WX belonged to R. Hallam of 81 New Street in Altrincham, which still stands to this day. The station of G5MB relocated to Heaton Mersey during 1949 and was still assigned to WH Lamb, but it appears that it was all but inactive after this time. G5WX doesn't appear after 1926, so it's probable that the call sign was returned to the post office and never reassigned. And G2YO was returned to the post office as well, but later reassigned to Rainbow Radio Manufacturing in Blackburn in Lancashire at some time during the 1940s. Now, one other call sign, G5MT, was used for a short time by the Manchester and District Wireless Society, but this was only during 1926 before being reissued to a station in Liverpool. The Manchester and District Wireless Society held the call sign G2FZ for some time, but this was handed back to the post office for reassignment to the Radio Experimental Society of Manchester. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Radio Experimental Society gave lecture demonstrations to members and visitors. One example was a Wednesday evening lecture during the July of 1931 where Mr. RMK lectured on the design and construction of an AC receiver. On the Friday of that week, a Mr. J.H.A. Meadowcroft also gave a demonstration of radio cabinet making. The society which owned the radio station G2FZ was keen to expand its membership of transmitting amateurs in the district, and they used this call sign, but it was eventually handed back to the post office at some time during the 1930s for reissue. The call sign continued to be used by an unrelated station in the 1950s. In 1927, the then Manchester Radio Society held the call sign G5LL. The station was based at 155 Oxford Road, Manchester, and like the G6MX premises in the same area, the house is long gone. Not much is known about this variant of Manchester Radio Society, how long it lasted and who was involved, but by the 1940s, G5LL was registered to a station in Mablethorpe, Lincolnshire, after possibly being handed back to the post office. Another early Manchester station was that of G5SS. This was the call sign of the then Stretford Radio Society based at 6A Derbyshire Lane, Stretford. Members of the Stretford and District Radio Society spent an evening on December the 9th, 1926 when a Mr. Haywood of the Dubalay Condenser Company lectured on condensers used in receiving radio sets of the time. With the aid of lantern slides, Mr. Haywood supplied a fascinating account of the various stages through which the condenser passes before it's finally placed on the market. The Stretford Society was concentrating on shortwave transmissions by the end of the 1920s and hoped to be transmitting on 8 metres with the call sign G5SS. The transmitter received its final calibration and the Society welcomed numerous reports of signal reception from far and wide. The Honourable Secretary of the Society was Mr. W.H. Hardingham of Burley Road, Stretford. Now, the call sign appeared well into the 1960s, but didn't appear to be linked to the Manchester area, so it's unclear what happened to the Society and the call sign in the end. And finally, let's take a step even further back in time to 1922. Around this time, there were 2 early wireless call signs associated with Metropolitan Vickers, a British heavy electrical engineering company of the early to mid-20th century. The experimental station in the research department at Metropolitan Vickers in Manchester became the first Manchester station of the BBC, working on a wavelength of 385 metres, with the call sign allocated to the BBC 2ZY. Official operations started at 24 hours notice on the 15th of November 1922. This was the day after the first broadcast from Savoy Hill, or G2LO in London. The first programme included general election results, children's stories and music by Uncle Humpty Dumpty and the Lady of the Magic Carpet, music from gramophone records, humorous stories by Mr. X and others, and records of dance music continuing until 1:15 in the morning. The station was staffed by members of the research department under H.G. Bell and by college apprentices who often had to fill in a gap by acting as artists as well as technicians. The early experimental programmes were sent out from a 50-watt transmitter constructed by the research department, but this was replaced by 700-watt equipment and later doubled in power made by the RCC, with which Metropolitan Vickers was technically associated. Reception was reported from places as far as Dingwall and Paris, Londonderry and the Channel Islands. The company continued to broadcast for the BBC under 2ZY until August of 1923, when a station of 5 kilowatt capacity was opened in Manchester. Towards the end of that year, American programmes broadcast on extra shortwave transmissions were being received with some success, and these were relayed from the research station on a call sign owned by Metropolitan Vickers, G2AC. So that is the story of some of the earliest radio societies and experimental stations in Manchester almost 100 years ago. Now, there are more. I did make a short film about G2QV of Altrincham Wireless Society, a link of which you can find in the description below. Now, you may be thinking about the lack of mention of what is probably the most well-known early call sign in Manchester, belonging to the station of G5MS, but that is another story for another time.